Thanks, Brian. Thanks, everybody, for having me. I'm looking forward to the conversation. I've been in supply chain about 15 years. I got my master's in industrial engineering from Georgia Tech and have been CSCP certified for about 5 years, too. I'm currently the director of global supply chain operations. That's demand, supply, inventory at Avaya. Previously, I was with Lenovo for 5 years, IBM for 5 years, and Accenture shortly before that. So I'm excited about the conversation. Thanks for having
me. Briefly before we get started, this is Brian again. I'm going to take you quickly through the Aberdeen research methodology so that at least you get a little background where some of the data came from or have a perspective on that as we talk through this. Aberdeen really writes from the best-in-class, that's our moniker, framework. And when we do our surveys, we try to get over 100 participants, and from that, statistically, we divide that into the top 20% are best-in-class, middle 50 are industry average, and the bottom 30. And the data you'll see is going to be best-in-class in all others, so it's the top 20 and the other 80. But that division comes based on performance metrics, and for supply chain, we almost always use customer service, cash flow, and gross margin. So you're really looking at cost, service, and inventory. And then for planning, we also use process metrics such as forecast accuracy. So you'll see a little bit of that as we walk through that. Our framework is such that when we survey the end users, we look at the pressures that they're feeling, the actions that they're taking to offset those, the capabilities that they have in place to make those actions take shape, and then the technology enablers behind that. So again, I'll be talking about some of the capabilities and enablers and even the pressures up front a little bit. But not to bore you with the methodology, but just a little background on that. The important thing is the story that we're going to hear today, which is about Avaya. And really, it's a supply chain transformation that is enabled by a vision, and it includes the people, the process, and the technology. So with that, I welcome you. And so you may be asking yourself, what's different about this case study? And so let me take that on right away. For me, when I heard the story, I said, you don't often get to hear an end-to-end, where did we start, and versus where we ended up, that is a complete transformation of a supply chain for a company. And the story spans a couple of years, and I think it's important for anybody that's a practitioner that is listening is you will find something that ties to your company. Because when Avaya started, I think Benji will tell you that they were in a firefighting mode. Not to suggest that all of you might be in that mode, but as they progressed, I would like to suggest that they're sort of at the top of the heap or close to it in terms of their capabilities and the way they run their supply chain. But somewhere along the line, you'll probably either connect with where you are relative to they transform. So listen closely to all the steps they went through and the processes that they changed and sort of the evolution, and that's the important thing. And so I think it's a great transformation story, and that's the reason I really wanted to bring this to the user community, because you don't always get one, and a picture's worth 1,000 words. I know when I'm writing, we often get case studies that are about a particular process, and not that they aren't good, but this is sort of a beginning to end, which I think is refreshing to hear, and you don't always come across that. And I'd say it's really the critical intersection of basic needs and a vision into a complete transformation. And it's got all the elements. It includes the technology side, but there's also a strong leadership component. What happened in the change management for the folks involved, and then the processes that they really had to change to make this happen. In the webinar, we're going to cover really where Avaya started, the circumstances and challenges, the catalyst for transformational change, and how they really got started in their approach, and then the results, the beginning and the end. But to begin with, I'll take you through at least the kind of pressures that we see from our end users when we survey them that companies are facing. No real surprise. Everybody sees the same pressures, but the point here is that the best-in-class prioritize them differently. They're much more focused on their operating cost and, the demand for faster, more accurate, and more fulfillment. And as you'll see, the all others group that are not best in class, they're really more concentrated on growing the top line revenue and trying to get things integrated. The reason I bring this up is as you listen to the story, recognize where Avaya started and the pressures that they felt, and then recognize where they finished and the things that they're concentrating on now. And I think you'll see a shift just in hearing this story. So with that, I want to point out that, look at where your organization is. Think about that as you're listening to this and maybe asking questions. Are you reacting to events that shape your schedule? Are you more proactive, where you can pull the story together to make those decisions? Or are you at the top of the value pyramid and you're really being predictive in terms of the kind of decisions and projections that you're making? So this is really where Avaya began. They sort of said to themselves, where are we and where do we want to be? And with that, I'll turn this back over to Benji and let him give you their starting situation, a little bit about Avaya. Go ahead, Benji.
Thanks, Brian. Just for all the participants, we're going to try and save 10 to 15 minutes at the end for questions. So if you have any, feel free to pile them up, and we'll look forward to getting some answers. Let me just first tell you, about Avaya. We are a global telecommunications company. We do about $4 billion of annual revenue, and about a third of that, 1.4 billion or so, is actual hardware product. We also have services and software solutions for call center, and lots of services in which we're supporting large networks. Let's see, you can keep hitting them. Thank you. We've got headquarters across Santa Clara, Singapore, Basking Ridge, Galway, and here in RTP, North Carolina's actual supply chain global headquarters. We've got a long legacy, a long history from AT&T to Lucent to Avaya. We're continually evolving, and over the last 10 years, we've had multiple acquisitions, mergers, and strategic partnerships. Some of those include RadVision was one of our acquisitions, Nortel Telecommunications, part of their business, was one of them, and we've recently gotten deals with HP and other very strategic alliances. To give you some sense of what we do and where we play, and back to you, Brian.
Okay, I was going to say, Benji, do you want to maybe take them through the situation that you started at, perhaps? I'm sorry.
Yeah, that's fine. Let's jump to the next slide.
Okay, I've got to start your beginning situation here.
I'm having a very slow time seeing the screens, so just give it 1 second, but I'll just start talking. It'll come up as I'm going, I'm sure.
Yeah. To help you out, the beginning is the recent Nortel acquisition is where you began.
Yeah, absolutely. So the story actually goes back a little further than that. It's been almost now 8 years since we originally engaged with Kinaxis and Rapid Response, and at the time we had done that to gain visibility to our component supply demand that we had recently outsourced to contract manufacturers. We had done this as part of a much broader initiative to overall reduce costs, leverage the capabilities of contract manufacturers, etc. But really, we kind of sat stagnant for 2 or 3 years, and we did very, very little with the tool above those basic initiatives. But then we acquired the Nortel Telecommunications division, and what that did was create a whole new list of challenges. First, we had 2 different organizations, obviously. We had 2 different cultures, 2 different groups of people that were not co-located together, very different processes, and from a very IT-related standpoint, totally different IT infrastructure. We had more than doubled the number of SAP or MRP instances we had, and just across the board, things were very, very fractured. So we realized at that point that we had to find a way to quickly consolidate, integrate, streamline both the people, the processes, and we knew we needed a tool to help us do that.
Okay, I think there's another point that Benji would make is that at that point everything was hard work and low value, and I think they had the tool, but the question is, was it the right one, and really how they leveraged it. So I'm gonna jump to sort of as a narrator here, the transformation, the plan and approach, and the approach was really to take on the technology decision. What did they really need to do, given that they doubled the number of ERPs? What were the challenges that they faced? And what were the organizational changes that they needed to make, and how they provided a catalyst for the transformation? We'll also point out that they made investment in people and hired domain experts for the key positions in logistics, procurement, planning, maintenance, and strategy. So there's a clear investment there, and there were some key leadership changes that made a difference as well. The leadership really provided, not just a vision, but they also knew what it would look like, at the end of the day, when the process was successful. So been there, done that, and at least so they had that, here's where we're going to end up. And they knew, some of the changes and transitions they were going to go through. So in that mode, the leadership really, had the vision to lead people through the maze and the fights that they were going to have to get into. And I think as Benji will tell you, that they started and they were firefighting, by design. And I think an important thing I want to bring out is that, as he explained to me, the whole idea of the firefighting was to bring in and get the hands-on accountability and the high accountability that they wanted across the supply chain. So there's a bit of a healthy firefighting and sort of approach to how they were going to solve that. And then for the transformation, they divided that into 5 phases. But before we get to that point, we're going to back up to, and have Benji take you through Avaya's planning strategy, sort of the solution decision, and how they arrived at that. Benji, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. Just one other point on the leadership, because it's so important to the overall conversation. We did several things around the leadership. There was definitely a large new leadership, an injection of external insights and people who come from other industries and kind of knew what best in class could look like. But the other big part of that was around culture change and the leadership driving that accountability as part of a culture shift, which would ultimately enable the success of the tool and the process changes that were ultimately to come. Okay, the next slide, talking about the overall solution decision. As I mentioned before, we did have a tool. The question is, were we going to stick with that tool, and was it right for the extended end-to-end type of view that we were really looking for? So the number one requirement, was clearly to standardize across all the people, all the processes, and all the different ERPs to get one controlled, synchronized process. The culture piece was part of it. Obviously, just the people was part of it. The location was part of it. But ultimately, we chose Kinaxis to stay as our main partner. They had been a good partner already. We had faith in what the tool could do, and there were some very specific criteria that we had looked at, and the reason we had selected Rapid Response. The primary one really is flexibility. If you're an active user of this, you may not know it. If you're an active author of it, you definitely do know it. But it has extreme flexibility. User-controlled much more than most other tools. If you're familiar with SAP, it takes $1 million in an act of Congress to make any change. That absolutely is not the case with Rapid Response, and that was one of the key differentiators. The price, the price is very competitive. Obviously, that was an important part of the decision, but far from the sole one. It has the ability to connect across multiple different data sources. So it's not just a bolt-on to an MRP, but you can take largely different and disparate types of information and IT sources and connect directly with them, or do a little data massaging via an FTP or a process protocol, and it'll automatically suck that data up. It's quickly adaptable, as I mentioned before, both in flexibility and also how quickly you can do it, make changes near real time. And then it's very user-friendly with a little bit of experience. So that really lends itself to creating a process and a tool, or through a tool, that allows you to hit to a best-in-class vision of how a process and performance should look.
Okay, this is Brian. I'll jump back in, and I think it's maybe worth a point of interest here that from the end user community, this is what we hear from our end users, in that 69% of the best in class, either partially or with all of their ERPs, they map up to an Uber planning tool, if you will, similar to what Benji just mentioned. And the point is that probably 30% of our respondents are in the service business, and versus maybe 70% being manufacturing. So very, very high percentage of those involved in the manufacturing side, look at this kind of a tool as a requirement for how they're going to run their business, so they get that end-to-end view. And as Benji, talks further and goes through the phases, you're going to hear a lot about that as part of the challenge that they face. I introduced the term best-in-class, so I'll briefly take you through what best-in-class metrics look like. I described that in the Aberdeen methodology, but just to actually review the hard numbers. The average customer service level for best-in-class is 93.7 versus 85.3. You can read the numbers, but that's about an 8.4% percentage point difference. And for those of us that have been through trying to improve service level, usually getting 1 point is like trying to turn a ship. So average cash conversion, 44 versus 65, it's about a third less. Average forecast accuracy at the family level, it's about 18.5 points difference. But if you think about the error rate for all others is 37%. The error rate for best in class is 18.5. So the forecast error is double that for the all others. So that means they have to change twice as many things when you think about it. Gross margin improvement, not quite double, but in the 75% range. And then one additional metric I put in here, which I think is relative to planning in particular, which is the forecast accuracy at the SKU level. Again, there's about a 20-point difference in whether you're at the SKU level or at the family level. The SKU level tends to run about 10 points less than it does at the family level. No surprise, but I think it's worth it to our listeners to point out that we do track the SKU level as well. It's not as good as at the family level, which is aggregated, but the percentage difference is pretty much the same at the SKU as at the family. And so the point here is the best-in-class performance really demands attention to the capabilities and the technology you're using to get those results. Because this is where it leads you. If you want to get these results, what do you have to do to get there? And I think that's the point in the discussion where we tend to focus on what the best-in-class do. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back to Benji and let him really begin the journey on where Avaya began and how they see themselves and how they moved on the value pyramid and walked through the phases. Go ahead, Benji.
Thanks, Brian. The critical thing about the best-in-class for us is that it was an aspiration. It was a benchmark. We knew we had to get there, and it was the mission of the leadership from the very beginning. And one of the very first things we did actually was do a great deal of external benchmarking. We brought in external consultants. We used companies like Aberdeen to gather this kind of data. And of course, we had that third-party leadership visibility that had a very good sense of what it could look like as well. One of the things we knew that we had to do to get to a best-in-class performance was to really transform the way each of our people work. And the way I'd like to like to show this is what's called the value pyramid. Um, in the next few minutes here, you'll see a pop-up around a questionnaire on the bottom right. So feel free to look at it, and I'll use it as a lead into this conversation. Excel is used extensively through medium and large enterprises. And while Excel is extremely user-friendly, it has a couple of really downsides. But the primary one is that when you're in Excel, you spend most of your time manipulating the data, pulling it together, concatenating, VLOOKUPs, pivots. All you guys, I'm sure, are very familiar with these activities. The problem with that is when you spend all your time doing that, you don't spend your time doing things that are driving value for the customer or for your shareholders. And so the more time you spend in this left-hand pyramid, in which you're doing a lot of your time is on data and information and basic synthesis, the less time you are understanding contextual trends, gaining knowledge about what's happening and driving the results, root cause, corrective action, and most importantly, taking action, because your action is valuable. Your action, solving a problem for a customer, that's valuable. Preventing it through better demand planning, that's valuable. Reducing costs by proactively rebalancing inventory at low-cost ocean freight instead of high-cost air freight, that's valuable to your shareholders. So the key and one of the underpinnings of all of our discussion and design work was around how do we move our employees up to the high value pyramid. And that's depicted on the right. And one of the great things about having a tool is that it can do the low value work for you, and even middle value analysis, etc., the more and more developed it is, which actually frees the people's time to go things like understand root cause corrective action, predict what's going to happen, manage the messaging, drive action for your customers, and overall profit. And a fundamental tenet of how we've implemented and how we design our processes is to continuously move from the left low-value pyramid to the high-value pyramid on the right-hand side. All right, let's go to the next slide.
Okay, so Benji, I've got the discussion points up, the critical thing about the value pyramid.
Yep, great, thank you. Again, what is the value? To know which way you've got to head. There's two types. There's an external value. It's customer related. Are you making your customers happy? All your decisions should have that in the back of its mind. Second, of course, is internal value. That's revenue and profit and employee satisfaction. And that certainly is a big part of the discussion, and particularly as you evolve and look to retain quality employees. And why is the value pyramid so important? It's because it's how you spend your time and your employees' time making value, right? And you can't do it when you're just squabbling through Excel updates all day long. You've got to have the time to think critically and to drive action and behavior. It's important that you know where you stand in this continuum of very low value added work to very high value added work. There's little things that make an employee more miserable than spending all their time doing low value work. People know that, they feel that. You've got to be realistic about where you are along that continuum and consistently, constantly, and intentionally work up. It is a spectrum. It's a journey. You don't do it overnight. You've got to have a constant theme, a constant initiative to do it. So don't think it'll happen overnight and all is wonderful. And ultimately, at the end of the day, when you've implemented the high-value pyramid, you'll get to a place where you've got foresight and predictability. You're not just focusing your head down, your head is up. You also be able to balance across the supply chain. What makes supply chain hard is the fact that it's so interdependent. Any individual discipline within it is not so challenging to optimize, but to optimize across them becomes very hard. And you need to see that end-to-end visibility to know that increased inventory, while may help customer satisfaction, will actually hurt expense when you ultimately write off some portion of that. So you've got to know those trade-offs. And then finally, having the time and the foresight to go take action to drive incremental improvements to both your customer's value and your internal value. We've got the results there of the poll, Brian?
Let's see. I don't have them.
We had the majority of the responses said no. So 14% said no, that they do not know of a multi-billion-dollar company run completely on Excel. So the majority of responses said no, they don't.
That's surprising.
I think that's encouraging, and that's what we sort of hope to hear. But so, and hence maybe, the frustration and the challenge that I think Avaya was, kind of where they began and some of the things they were dealing with. So, so at this point, it's time to actually talk through the journey. Now that we've sort of set the stage a little bit about where Avaya began and certainly where the employees saw themselves. And Benji's going to take you through the 5 phases, and this is where I think most of our listeners will connect at some point along the way. Because when you see where they began versus where they ended up, it covers just about everybody. So Benji, I'll let you take over from here. I've got phase 1 up.
Okay, thank you. As I mentioned, this was a while ago when we did the very initial phase. It was a basic rapid response implementation, which connected and gave our contract manufacturers a resource to go load their supply-demand data on the component side. We outsourced our BOMs to the contract manufacturers, and so that part of visibility was no longer in our SAP's functions, and the overall purchasing of all those components and therefore the supply-demand was also outsourced. So we had lost that visibility, and we had to regain it so we could get some control around the overall supply-demand operations. We put it in as a response to the change in a sourcing strategy. And the reason I highlight that is because instead of having a very well thought out long-term plan, we did not originally, and this was back in 2008, it really was a response to a material sourcing strategy change, and it therefore was not accompanied by a robust, comprehensive strategy about supply-demand management. This was before we had brought in most all of our new leadership, from our COO to our supply chain VP to lots of the business leaders that we now have. It was not really designed for business or process integration. It's pretty granular and siloed view of what this initial implementation delivered for us. And while it was used and we did gain some controls around our contract manufacturers, it had relatively minimal benefits. So from here, it sat stagnant for a few years, and then we had the precipitous of we actually went private equity, had brought in new leadership, and also the Nortel acquisition, and that really what prompted phase 2.
Okay, I've got phase 2 up now, Benji.
All right. I've used the little monkey to the left here just to give a sense of our evolution and where we were in the overall process. After those 3 precipitous I mentioned earlier, we decided to stick with rapid response and really started to develop a roadmap, or a multi-year roadmap, of how we would roll it out or start to integrate our different processes. We didn't have them all perfectly defined at the beginning of phase 2, but we absolutely had a set of priorities, and we knew what the most important things were that we had to tackle. If you went back to Brian's original slide about kind of the evolution of the priority of the leadership, at this point we were very much about just trying to make sure we were shipping orders and we were maximizing the revenue. Relatively low and certainly not best in class as a priority. But we had to firefight the supply constraints, regain visibility, to our finished goods supply demand, and therefore optimize shipments and revenue. So what we did, the first thing we addressed was basically supply forecasting and ultimately supply commit visibility. So how do we convert an independent demand into a dependent demand, and then ultimately get the supply commits back integrated from our contract manufacturers into this one platform. That way we could at least get a forward view, roughly 16 or 4 months rolling visibility to the supply-demand balance we had. We could see constraints, we could start working them in advance, do things like rebalance, shift supply from one location to the other. And this really was the initial phase. From that, it also, of course, created an inventory model. Obviously, supply greater than your demand is a prediction of inventory, so it's a very rudimentary inventory model. And then also we used it for kind of rudimentary transportation planning. We could see how many units of each code we had committed, and from that we used it to calculate some basic freight outlooks. So this was phase 2. It moved from a component view into a finished good view, and it was really the first step, and at this point what we knew was going to be a much broader and expansive journey.
Okay, I've got phase 3 up now for you.
Thank you. Okay, phase 3 was our first foray really into sales and operations planning. And at this one, we really started to become, after the implementation of this, started to become pretty dangerous. We at least had a little stone tool like this gentleman on our left. It was focused on the demand planning side, and we primarily wanted to reduce a lot of the low value added work that was currently happening between the demand planning process and all of our MRPs and ultimately rapid response. That was not in any way automated at the time. The demand planning process in itself, the way we analyze the parts, the way we visualize the parts, the way we manage the process, was not standardized. And we didn't have a clean integration between the demand planning and the supply planning. There were two separate processes, one outside of rapid response, one inside rapid response, and we knew we needed to solve that right away. So one of the key things we did to make our planning much more accurate was to what we call flatten the plannable parts. So we had roughly 3,000 sellable part numbers, but about 1,000 of those are the result of the configuration of stockable parts. So I'd stock code A, B, and C, and I would kit that in some way to sell code D. So we reduced from planning the sellable parts down to only the stockable manufacturable parts from about 3,000 to 2,000 parts. We saw a 6-7 point forecast accuracy increase within 60 days of implementation of phase 3. This really was a huge step. We also automated the low-value interfaces with SSP and load validation. We used to spend about 2 days every month in any interim changes just loading the data from our Excel spreadsheets in demand planning into the multiple SAP instances we had. And then another couple of days at the start of the following week just doing a load validation to make sure that what we put in is what we got out, and troubleshooting any variations. Extremely low value work, and we automated almost all of that. We do no work now around the load. It does loads every Friday. The team can go in and make changes throughout the week. It'll upload directly into each of the SAP instances. This was across both the Nortel Legacy and the Avaya Heritage boxes. And then we actually put in a process that kicked back to us an automatic validation that said, here was what we tried to load, and on Monday morning, here's what we actually see in the system. And while there are still occasionally errors, such as the BOM wasn't set up or sourcing wasn't set up or something like that, they're valid errors. And so now, yes, we go do work from that, but that work is solving problems and creating value. We also took our first step in integrating a third-party data set, and that was taking the distributor data, i.e. their sales out and their inventory, and putting that inside of rapid response so we could compare side by side. And then it was critical in our implementation of vendor-managed inventory, how we reported that data, how we used it in our supply-demand analysis. And vendor-managed inventory is a huge benefit from a cash flow standpoint, and we leverage the tool to help with that integration. I think those are the big hitters on phase 3. I'm watching my time. Let's jump to phase 4, please, Brian.
Okay, you're on phase 4 now, and I'll just make a comment that as we finish the phases, Benji is actually going to take you through the hard results beginning to end, and we'll certainly take questions at the end, but you will see, you know, what the numbers are on working capital and what happened to the inventory. But we can certainly answer questions along the way, or after the fact, I should say. But just to let you know that is coming, and we will hit the results. So, Benji, you're on phase 4. Go ahead.
Thank you. Okay, the phase 4 was really kind of like an S&OP phase 2. The first process had tremendous benefits, but we knew there was more, and at this point, we really started to believe in the extension of the tool and what it could deliver for us. So we took the distributor data, which was previously at that sellable part number I mentioned, and actually flattened its data as well, so that now we could see our distributor data lined up exactly to how we do our planning. Very powerful, and knowing that 70% of our sales go through distribution, their supply-demand balance is incredibly important to my supply-demand balance. We also started to integrate a lot of things, kind of softer things, life cycle management. Is a product trending up, trending down, end of sale dates, lots of things around, you know, general availability dates, things like transition keys. So now I could compare code A to code B. The volume on code A or B is directly dependent on how we sold code A and how those two match together. Extremely important for product transitions. And then we also started to do things like what we call SKU paired analytics here. Yeah, code A plus code B should represent some kind of trend, in tying them together in a way that allows you to quickly analyze how the two are doing relative to each other. We also pulled in another third-party data source, and that was our sales funnel data. Most of our sales go through a quoting process first, and as we can integrate and analyze that sales data, the better we can predict and foresee what kind of trends we'll see on the actual sales when they convert to orders. We also, for the first time, implemented what-if scenario modeling, which allowed us to preview what supply-demand impacts spend by a supplier would be, etc., before we actually push it into MRP and ultimately to our suppliers. We've got a little question to your right. Get a quick poll to see how many of you currently are using what-if scenario planning in your current processes, if you'd take a look at that. It's very powerful for prediction, controlling the messages, particularly with your supply base. And we also started really focus the team's work on alerts. You know, don't go look at 1,000 parts every day. Look at the 50 that have an alert. And therefore, your actions become, you know, optimized on the most critical areas, and you know there's a problem versus just randomly sorting through data. And then we also started to do a lot of dashboards, presentation of product transitions, how quickly you can look at 4 things in one dashboard, which otherwise you'd have to jump to 4 workbooks, so it's much faster of overall analysis. At this point, things really started to quiet down. We really stopped doing firefighting. We started to reach best-in-class metrics. So this phase, coming out of this phase, things really, you could see a dramatic difference in our results.
And you put phase 5 up for you?
Thank you. Looks like about half the participants do some scenario planning already. That's great. Have got some opportunity there. Phase 5, we turned more towards the procurement engine and primarily focused on product cost reductions. So what we had done previously when we'd taken the bombs out of SAP, or MRPs, we ultimately have gone back and put those bombs back in. And through doing, we can explode and see the supply-demand at multiple levels, at a sales level, at a production level, at a inventory level of those components monetize those components and really focus on where we can get the best cost reductions by driving specific actions around those components that have the greatest spend. Integrating the BOM was a big part of heavy lifting there, but in the end it makes both the reporting, the tracking, and the finding the biggest opportunities for cost savings really stand out. We also made some tweaks around transportation and improving that so we can model whether we're going to use ocean or air on one code, multiple sites, multiple plants. It's gotten our freight prediction much more accurate, and also gives a much better view of the predicted shortages or longs, inventory, etc. And then we also created a distributor predictive model, which starts to overlay analytics around the distributor behavior. Are they underordered? Are they overordered? And from that more prescriptive answer, we can go take action. Call the distributor, you're overstocked, don't order anymore, even block orders and things like that. And then lastly, we continue to extend those dashboards we talked about in Phase 4, really trying to make analysis quicker and quicker by looking at multiple variables simultaneously. Those are the 5 we've done so far. We have actually just approved Phase 6 and are really, really excited about starting implementation there. So more to come.
So I think at this point we want to take it to results and success, and this is where you get to see the hard numbers. As Benji walked you through the 5 phases, it's a gigantic process evolution and organizational revolution that they went through. But I think it'll be important for you to see what the actual measurements and results are. I'll briefly take you to, though, we talked about the capabilities that help the best-in-class get to where they want to be. And you probably heard many of these as Benji got to levels 4 and 5. But the first one is being able to respond to unplanned events in a timely manner. Notice that the best-in-class is literally twice as likely to have that in place. That means that they've done the scenario planning up front. And if you look at the next 2, it's where they started the scenario planning, but it gets you to the ability to be able to respond to the unplanned event because you're prepared. But the first one is the unconstrained planning, which is, what's it going to take question, meaning this is really the demand, what does it look like for us? And then the constrained planning scenario is, what are we able to do, and where are the limits, and where are the bottlenecks that we're going to have to deal with. But again, you can see the order of magnitude of the best-in-class capabilities compared to all others. That it's in 50 to 70% more likely that they're going to have that in place, and those are huge differences. These are not like very small, less than 10%. These are tremendously large differences, and again, you heard those capabilities that they were able to establish when they got to the what-if scenario planning. And then lastly, I would talk about the predictive analytics and, what do you need to do with inventory? What can you do with inventory, to maximize service, profitability, cash flow, all those metrics. And you heard, again, Benji, as they got to level 5, those are the kinds of things that they began to see and discuss. So with that, I'm gonna turn it back to him and let him talk about, what success means. And I've got it, on the very, very first bullet on exceed customer and employee expectations.
Thank you, Brian. We defined and created a vision that said we want to exceed customer and employee expectations while fueling profitable growth. And the first piece of that here is exceed customer expectations. And over the last, again, this has been a long journey, guys, so keep that in mind. But as you can see on the left-hand side here, on-time ship, 94%. We're actually tracking above 95% this quarter. But you can see the improvement. We were actually in the 70s the year prior to, in 2010, but from 86% up to 94%. So we've hit best-in-class and have sustained that not only monthly but near weekly. Also, our revenue view of that, we were carrying an average of about $42 million of past due revenue. As you can see, we attacked that first, and I mentioned that earlier on. Got that down fairly quickly and have been able to sustain it. We're actually averaging almost 3 this quarter. And the last one is the Net Promoter Score, which is a cross-industry, purely third-party model that looks at how likely your customers are to recommend you to another customer. So really important from driving growth and overall customer satisfaction. And that's grown from 27 up to 50 as at the end of the year, and that's actually at 53 now. Best in class there is 50. So tremendous progress from both an internal and external view on customer satisfaction. And to the low value versus high value comment I made earlier around employee impact. We look at this in really 2 key ways. First is our top performer attrition. We were at only 2.6% of our top performers in attrition last year. And I think more telling really is engagement scores. And this is a measure, again, a third-party administered measure of how engaged, involved, committed your employees are. And you can see over the same time period from 2011 to 2013, we've had tremendous improvement, nearly 60% improvement. I fundamentally believe that's largely due to being in the high-value pyramid. It's just better work, it's more fun, it's more rewarding. All right, next slide. Talking about driving profitable growth, that's the other key one. And so we've got a comparison here of where we started to where we ended. You can see the types of improvements we were talking about, roughly 6% reduction in inventory and turns, cash-to-cash improvement of over 40%, the average past due I'd mentioned at over greater than 75%, big improvement on the Net Promoter Score, reduced risk from write-offs and bad inventory, if you will, by nearly 90%. Overall supply chain expense, this is dollar for dollar EBITDA to the bottom line at over 30%, and gross margin improvement of nearly 30% improvement. But interesting is how does that compare to overall best-in-class performance across the rest of the industry, or even outside the industry. So looking at the profit. Our overall expense to revenue ratio, best-in-class is 4.2%. We hit 4% at the end of last year. We've actually dipped below that now. Annual gross margin increase, this is a year-over-year change. We've been averaging about 3.4% over those 3 years. That's repeated year-to-year improvement. Customer sat, on-time ship, 94%, as we mentioned earlier. That's at 95 now. Net Promoter Score, best in class is 50. We were actually at 53 just last quarter. And then the last one being cash. Cash-to-cash cycle, 44 days. We're actually at 26, largely due to our accounts payable as well as our accounts receivable and inventory reductions. And then the last one is those inventory turns. We are not quite at best in class. We are at 9.2 turns, but I think we hit 11, maybe even 12 by the end of this year, so getting close on that one.
I want to jump back in and sort of point out that, the transformation impact here. And almost by any measure, the point I want to bring out is that they're transformative levels. They're not just incremental. I know when we look at it from the research end of it, I mean, these are dramatic changes. And honestly, if you looked at the all others, those are the kind of numbers that they started with. And they certainly ended up, at a much, much higher level. They exceeded their goal of employee turnover, which I think, as I talked with Benji, that's one of the most exciting things to them, to Avaya, which is the employee engagement and empowerment, and which reduced the turnover, and one of the most exciting outcomes, in addition to the business metrics. So there's passion about the level of engagement and employee satisfaction that came out of the transformation, and I think the point is that as he described the high-value pyramid, I don't really think there's much doubt that that's where they ended up, and they continue to sort of raise the bar on what that top level of the pyramid is as they move into phase 6. So I think the point here would be is that they achieved what they started at, and they continue to find more to improve upon. But I think the transformation over the course of 4 or 5 years is quite dramatic, and again, sort of one of the reasons that we wanted to bring this case study to you. I'll give you some key takeaways that jump out at me as I heard the story and I talked with Benji. The success is due to the leadership and the vision. That they weren't going to get there without that. But I would also say all the other pieces had to be there. You had to have the technology for that to succeed. They had to be able to change the process, and they had to have engagement of the people. I don't think any one of the four could have carried the water, for the whole transformation. So this is a coming together, I'd say, of the vision with all of the components. Again, on the people side, they moved from the low value to the high value pyramid, enabled by the technology, but it took the vision and leadership to get there. At the process level, they initially utilized their solution for kind of more lower value work, but this is where the vision helped them. The technology was there, but the vision moved them along the line and said, we can do better. And then the people took it and ran with it and said, yeah, we can make that happen. The technology alone, having the right technology, provided an end-to-end view that was essential to the success. And without that, as the enabler, it was going to be very, very tough to move from a low value to a high value. So, again, all the elements were there. And I'd say, again, can't emphasize enough, and I think Benji would agree pretty much that the leadership and the vision and the belief, honestly, and you can translate leadership into belief and commitment that the organization was going to get there. And as they moved through the phases, I think that commitment, moved from just the leadership itself to the employees, and they began to believe. And it sounds to me like, they're finding more ways where they can grow, and they may, again, break the ceiling here on where they can move. So that concludes the formal part of the webinar, and I think we want to open it now to questions, either to myself or Benji, or comments that you might have to make. Alyssa, would you maybe perhaps summarize, or do you want to read a couple of them?
Yes,
or what's the
certainly.
best way to handle this real quickly?
Yeah, we do have a few questions in the queue. So I have one here for Benji. And somebody is asking, how painful was it for users initially in phase one?
In phase one, I wasn't around, so I can't say definitively. I can talk phase two, because that's really where we started doing a lot of the integration. And, frankly, a lot of people didn't believe that we would get the benefits at all. So there was a lot of inertia against really trying to move from what we were doing in Excel and manual loads into SAP up into using rapid response. And clearly there was a learning curve with the technology. We still have that every time somebody comes on board. But the learning is relatively quick, as quick as other tools I've used. I think the emotional inertia, frankly, was the bigger challenge.
Okay, I have another question. What level in the company sponsored this project, and from what functions?
This was primarily driven as a supply chain tool. It's primarily used as a supply chain tool. We use it for lots of other kind of reporting and predictive analytics, but it certainly is sponsored, funded by our supply chain. So our COO and our vice president of supply chain had committed to the tool. That includes procurement as part of that organization. And, of course, IT, from implementation, connectivity, project management, etc. And then, obviously, finance was part of it from ROI evaluation. But primarily, supply chain was the champion for sure.
Okay, and the questions just keep rolling in. Were you able to quantify the working capital impacts from the inventory reduction during the various phases? And if so, what were they?
I've not tried to do that specifically. Total inventory reduction has been north of $130 million, and we've reduced our days cash to cash by another, 20 some dollars. 20 some days. So I don't know off the top of my head, but I'd say in the neighborhood of $250 million roughly.
Okay. Another question for you, Benji. How confident can you be on the predictive analytics?
It depends on the analytics, honestly, and I try to work really closely and have the team, and they certainly are very cognizant of. Some of them are quite predictive. Some of them are much less predictive. You find naturally this trade-off between the confidence of the prediction or the analysis and the time and how much lead time you have. So as an example, our funnel analytics. It's what our salespeople are quoting today, which we may get an order for in 4 or 5 months. While it's kind of low confidence, only about a third or even less of those quotes convert into a real order, and therefore it's 70% wrong, it's giving me 4 or 5 months lead time. So that lead time is extremely valuable to the supply chain, right? So we certainly try to be cognizant of it. Some of them are very discrete and very directional, but it's a very important thing to understand. And great question. You got to know the confidence versus the value.
Okay. How did you improve forecast accuracy? By more collaboration with potential customers, or more analytics, or both?
Well, there's 2 big streams around our forecasting process that have changed dramatically. The first was getting the number right, the traditional measure of forecast accuracy. And that jumped from the low 60s to the low 70s. And we did that 2 ways, really. Not the 3, I guess. The first one was flattening from sellable part numbers to the plannable part numbers. Just a reduction of skew, reduction in volatility driven by that naturally improves forecast accuracy. The second one was spending a lot more time analyzing things like the funnel, which allowed us to get indications and trend and predictions, and working with the BU as an example around product transitions and life cycles and changes made around sales promotions, and just having that time to go investigate more things helped a lot. And then the third one really was around the distributor data. Being able to quickly analyze the distributor data helped a lot. But the other big trend, and I'd say probably more important, was once you get into the 70s around forecast accuracy, there's diminishing returns like one-time shift. You invest a lot and get very little. And so we've converted a lot of our focus to not knowing the right number, but knowing which way we can afford to be wrong. So as one code, I'm always willing to have a month's too many. I don't care because it's cheap, but it's good for customer sat. Another code is extremely expensive, and I don't ever want to have too many. I'm willing to air freight for it. We call that being wrong in the right direction. And honestly, that has been the more transformative of the 2.
Great. So we come to the end of our time, but there is one question that a few people are anxious to know, and that is, what is planned for Phase 6? Is there a centralized live control room planned?
We do not have the NASA space station planned yet. I know a lot of companies do that. We have a very robust process that tracks critical shortages every day, interlocks between our supply assurance and our order management, prioritizing freight, et cetera, et cetera. So we have a process that mimics that kind of control tower concept. We don't have a big room where we all sit in it and look at the screen together, though. That said, Phase 6 is really integrating a couple big things. The first one is getting much better at our inventory process, and specifically the financials around inventory management. Gross, reserve, net, broker scrap, secondary market recovery. Again, really extending it from basic operational play to incorporate another partner in the supply chain, and that's our broker market. That's one big one. And then the second big one is really, integrating even deeper across supply and demand. Things like on-time ship at an individual code level. Right? People report high numbers, but doing an individual code, predicting what it's going to be in 3 weeks from now. So integrating across those in a much more deep and complex way, actually. Those are the two big things we got.
Great. Well, we've reached the end of the webcast. Thanks, Brian and Benji, for joining. And thanks to everybody who asked questions today.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, Brian.